7 a.m. in the South China Sea. The sky was thick and heavy. A piercing scream tore through the sky, followed by a terrifying explosion. It shook the entire sea region. Flames erupted violently, illuminating a massive steel structure twisting in agony. It was the HD-981 oil rig, a symbol of China's expansionist ambition. The rig shook violently. Steel fragments burst apart like deadly fireworks. Panic-stricken screams were immediately drowned out by the roar of twisting metal and secondary explosions. On the radar screen of a Chinese escort destroyer, the red alert siren blared too late. Countless strange red dots flashed, then disappeared in a mess of electronic interference. Their communication system was completely paralyzed. They had no idea what attacked them or where it came from. Far above the sky, gliding silently, were the ghostly silhouettes of F-35C jets from the carrier air wing of the 7th Fleet. They had just completed their mission, quietly leaving the scene, before Beijing could grasp what had just happened. Washington had acted, not with a warning, not with an economic sanction. This was a precise and devastating military strike. They had targeted Beijing's strategic asset, right in the disputed waters of the Philippines. Beijing was in utter shock. Manila held its breath. The entire South China Sea chessboard was flipped overnight. It all began with an act of escalation, an unmistakable display of arrogance from Beijing. The HD-981 oil rig, a steel giant worth billions of dollars, was not just an economic tool. It was a geopolitical weapon, a symbol of expansionist ambition, a steel spearhead China intended to use to pierce the international order, defying the PCA International Court ruling, ignoring Manila's strong objections, and disregarding Washington's diplomatic warnings. Beijing boldly dragged this colossal machine straight into Second Thomas Shoal. This was not a random choice. Second Thomas Shoal is the hottest flashpoint, where the BRP Sierra Madre rests. A fragile yet steadfast symbol of Philippine sovereignty, standing guard, and this time, escorting the HD-981, were not just Coast Guard or militia fishing boats. Beijing had deployed conventional military forces, a powerful naval fleet, led by Type 052D destroyers, Chinese destroyers, loaded with vertical missile launchers. They lined up like a wall of steel, daring anyone to stand in their way. China's intentions were crystal clear. This was a test, a deliberate provocation. Beijing was posing a blunt question, not only to Manila, but to Washington as well. Does the so-called U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, signed back in 1951, still hold value? Or is it just a Cold War relic on paper? If the U.S. didn't respond, Second Thomas Shoal would be lost, the Sierra Madre would be crushed, and that would set a precedent for China to swallow the rest of the South China Sea. If America backed down, the entire security and alliance network that Washington had painstakingly built in Asia would begin to crack and collapse. Manila had no way out. They did the one thing Beijing least expected. Immediately, the president of the Philippines announced the activation of Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. They directly called China's action an act of aggression, an armed attack, through illegal occupation of their sovereign territory. All eyes within the next 24 hours turned toward Washington, and the Pentagon was ready. They had foreseen this move and had been waiting for it. Carrier Strike Group 5, led by the USS Ronald Reagan, was not aimlessly patrolling. It was waiting in the Philippine Sea, just a few hundred nautical miles from Second Thomas Shoal, beneath the deep waters. At least 2 Virginia-class fast-attack submarines, the planet's most fearsome submarine hunters, had quietly taken up hunting positions. They locked down every avenue of movement for the Chinese fleet, ready to fire Mark 48 torpedoes on command. Washington did not negotiate. They were not overly concerned. They issued a clear, hard, and cold ultimatum. 24 hours for Beijing to withdraw immediately and unconditionally. The HD-981 rig and all its escort vessels out of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The clock started counting down. Beijing's response was predictable. They ignored it. A foreign ministry spokesman declared this was a brutal interference in China's internal affairs and loudly insisted the Chinese armed forces were ready to defend themselves against any provocative act. They made a fatal miscalculation. They thought this was still a gray zone game, where Coast Guard ships could ram, water cannons could suppress, and the U.S. would stop at diplomatic measures. They were wrong. 24 hours expired. T-minus 30 minutes. From the bow of the USS Ronald Reagan, 2 squadrons of EA-18G Growlers took off. They carried no bombs. They carried electronic storms. The Growlers climbed to high altitude and began activating their arrays of equipment. Next-generation electronic warfare YELQ-99 pods. The entire second Thomas Shoal area, in an instant, was submerged in a dense electronic fog. On the Type 050 2D destroyers, disaster struck. Radar officers frantically stared at their screens. Their advanced Type 346A Dragon Eye radars, which prided themselves on tracking hundreds of targets, suddenly went blank. Chaotic interference, then darkness. Communications from VHF to satellite were reduced to meaningless screeches. They were blinded and silenced, completely cut off from Central Command in Hainan. They did not know what was coming. T-minus 10 minutes. 2 squadrons of F-35C Lightning IIs. The stealthy Lightning Shadows quietly departed the carrier. They flew in full stealth mode, skimming low over the sea to avoid any chance of detection, even though the enemy radar systems were already incapacitated. To the dazzled Chinese fleet below, the sky remained eerily calm. Not a warning, not a sign of impending death. The F-35Cs were in firing position. Pilot, lead confirmed the target. Through the electro-optical targeting system, advanced targeting optics. The target was clear, glowing brightly on the infrared sensor. The HD-981 rig. The Pentagon had issued very clear instructions. Avoid at all costs an all-out war. The targets were not the Type 052D warships. The target was the rig, the symbol of aggression. Weapons would be released from a safe distance, outside the escort's crippled air defense envelope. Although their defenses had been neutralized, the F-35Cs simultaneously launched their weapons. They did not use unguided bombs. They used precision standoff strike munitions, not only smart and lethal weapons. The first wave were AGM-154J Joint Standoff Weapons, JSOW. These weapons did not simply fall. They glided intelligently for tens of kilometers, each one programmed to strike precisely the 4 weakest points of the rig, the 4 giant support legs. The aim was to destroy the structure. 2. Collapse the stability of the tens of thousands-ton steel behemoth. The second wave, immediately after, were AGM-158 JASSMs. These stealthy cruise missiles flew lower. They were designed to penetrate, to punch through thick steel plating, aimed directly at 2 core targets: the control center, the brain that operated the entire rig, and the main engine room, its power heart. The first explosion occurred at a support leg. The sound of snapping steel rang out, chilling. The rig heeled hard to one side. Seconds later, the control center Finally, the main engine room ignited. A massive black plume rose into the sky. The HD-981 rig, Beijing's pride, had become a dead torch. It began sinking toward the seafloor. This was a surgically precise, ruthless strike. Washington proved 3 things in one night. First, they dared to fire. The red line of the Mutual Defense Treaty is real, drawn in gunpowder, not in mere words. Second, they can strike and China cannot stop it. The perfect combination of the EA-18G's electronic warfare and the F-35C's near-absolute stealth completely neutralized the defenses that Beijing prided itself on. They were hit without firing a single shot in return. Third, they controlled escalation by striking only the rig, a symbolic asset, and sparing the escorting warships. The U.S. kicked the ball of responsibility back to Beijing. They made clear this was punishment for aggression, not yet a war. As for China, this was a humiliation, a strategic shock. They were completely on the back foot. Their entire plan had prepared for a gray zone skirmish scenario. They had readied Coast Guard ships, water cannons, and armed fishing boats, prepared for collisions, ramming to force the Philippines to back down. They absolutely were not prepared for a high-speed conventional military strike, using stealth weapons and electronic suppression. Their entire baited trap strategy, the gray zone strategy they used to intimidate their neighbors, collapsed in mere minutes. Before real American military power, Beijing's fury was only beginning. When the news that the HD-981 rig was burning and sinking was confirmed and relayed back to Beijing, the initial shock quickly turned into fury, a nationwide fury. At Zongnanhai, the air was thick. This was not just a loss of assets. It was a resounding slap in the face, a public humiliation before the world. They had been struck on their own doorstep, and their formidable escorts were unable to fire back, even a single round. Immediately, the U.S. ambassador in Beijing was summoned at 4 a.m. to receive a diplomatic protest, which was in essence a threat. China declared this an act of war, state terrorist attack, and vowed the United States would pay dearly. China's state media was unleashed. Television channels seethed. Online outlets ran banner headlines, calling for revenge to settle the score. Cries to sink U.S. carriers echoed across social media. Wounded national pride was turning into belligerent rage. Orders were issued from the highest level, transmitted straight to the Southern Theater Command. At all costs, make the 7th Fleet pay. The problem was, at what price? China's generals, for the first time in decades, had to face a real war scenario against the planet's strongest adversary. They had 3 options on the table, each fraught with risk. The most proportionate retaliation: activate the anti-ship ballistic missile units, the DF-21D force, and the DF-26, the carrier killers. Beijing's pride. All mobile launchers were put on red alert, ready to fire. But one question chilled the spine of the strategists. What happens after firing a ballistic missile at a U.S. carrier, nuclear-powered, would be tantamount to declaring total war. That is the final red line. Was Beijing ready for a world war? While their economy still depends deeply on exports, while their navy, though powerful, has never seen real combat. Moreover, the U.S. 7th Fleet is not standing still. Somewhere out there lurk Virginia-class U.S. submarines, ready to strike back at those very missile bases. And can the DF-26 really get past the wall of the dense Aegis defense network with SM-3 and SM-6 missiles, or not? Hesitation, fear of an even more humiliating defeat shelve this option. The second scenario: deploy the submarine force. The entire attack subfleet, Type 09B class boats, received orders to sortie, to hunt for the USS Ronald Reagan strike group. They wanted a sneak attack, a dagger thrust from the seafloor. But this was nearly to the United States. The South China Sea isn't murky, it's transparent, with a dense sonar network, with P-8 Poseidon subhunters constantly prowling overhead, and most fearsome of all, the Virginia-class submarines themselves, designed to hunt enemy submarines. China's noisier Type 093 boats were nearly detected the moment they left Yulin Naval Base on Hainan. This scenario was dropped for excessive risk. Finally, the third and most viable scenario was chosen: an air retaliation strike, strong enough to save face, fast enough to respond, yet still below full-scale war. The Southern Theater Command ordered a large-scale sortie. Waves of J-16 fighters, an upgraded derivative of the Su-30, loaded with YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, took off from bases on Hainan. Supporting them was a squadron of J-20s, the mighty Dragon stealth fighters, tasked with clearing a path, destroying U.S. escort fighters. Their objective: pierce the U.S. carrier's defensive ring and fire their missiles at all costs. The key notional air battle began. Chinese squadrons flew low, hugging the sea, trying to hide below the radar horizon. But they underestimated the opponent. High above at 33,000 feet, far behind the fleet, an E-2D Hawkeye, the fleet's eye, was calmly on station. Its massive APY-9 radar could see everything, sweeping a vast expanse of ocean. The J-16s, though flying low, still appeared clearly, one by one on the E-2 operator's screen. Multiple targets approaching fast, low level, bearing 270. Immediately, for F-35CS, on combat air patrol, received vectors. This was not an old-school dogfight, like in the movies. This was 21st century warfare of data and networks. The F-35C pilots did not switch on their radars. They didn't need to. That would make them targets. They kept absolute silence, utterly invisible. They received all target data directly from the E-2 Hawkeye via the Link 16 data link on their helmet-mounted displays. The F-35C pilots saw the entire Chinese formation from hundreds of miles away. They could clearly see the low-flying J-16s and even detected the higher-flying J-20s trying to conceal themselves. The game began. The F-35C pilots did not rush in. They acted like conductors, orchestrating a deadly symphony. They approached the J-16 formation from both flanks, still out of sight, beyond the enemy's radar coverage. Using electro-optical sensors, they hardlocked the J-16 targets without emitting a single radar pulse. But they did not fire. Instead, the F-35C flight lead executed a tactic called cooperative engagement. He illuminated the target and transmitted that target lock data, not to another F-35C, but straight back to an Aegis cruiser, a Ticonderoga-class ship. The Hound escorting the Ronald Reagan. About 93 miles away, aboard the Aegis cruiser, the fire control officer received gold, a target already locked by an F-35. Vertical launchers fired from the cruiser's bow. Massive SM-6 missiles howled upward into the sky. In the J-16 cockpits, disaster struck. The Chinese pilots had yet to see a U.S. ship, hadn't even detected the F-35CS. Their radar screens were completely blank. Suddenly, their RWRs screamed warnings. Missiles incoming from an impossible direction. They had no idea what was happening, who fired from where. Panic, with no other way to survive. The J-16 pilots were forced to jettison their weapons. They dumped all their heavy YJ-83 anti-ship missiles into the sea, hit full afterburner, and broke hard, fleeing in chaos. The J-20 squadron, the stealth escorts, was now fully exposed. Their mission had failed. They could not shield the strike package, nor did they dare risk engaging F-35CS under such unfavorable conditions. With no idea where the enemy was, they quietly turned away and vanished. Beijing's retaliatory strike had been broken, without a single F-35C firing around, without a single U.S. warship scratched. The humiliation now multiplied. On the international stage, a diplomatic storm erupted. Russia immediately condemned America's Cowboy Act, calling for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. And that was all Moscow could do. No military move. Bogged down themselves in Ukraine. Japan, Australia, and the UK issued joint statements discreetly backing, stressing the need to uphold a rules-based order and freedom of navigation. Most notable, however, was ASEAN's silence. The bloc was deeply split. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, also claimants, issued restraint statements urging calm. But inside their military staffs, a rapid analysis was underway. The U.S. had proved it would not just talk, it was ready to act. The posture and balance of power in the South China Sea had truly shifted. The defeat of the J-16s and J-20s was even more painful and humiliating than losing the HD-981 rig. It was not merely a tactical setback. It struck at their military doctrine, a slap to the pride of a rising superpower. For years, Beijing had poured trillions of yuan into building an air and naval force they believed could challenge the United States. But in the first real confrontation, even a notional one, their technology failed miserably. They realized a harsh truth. In a high-tech, conventional maritime showdown, they could not defeat the U.S. 7th Fleet. The J-16s, once hailed as ship killers, had to dump their weapons and run without ever seeing the enemy. The mighty Dragon J-20 stealth fighters, their pride, were utterly helpless at shielding the strike force and didn't dare risk tangling with F-35CS. In an environment of total U.S. situational awareness dominance, Beijing now stood at a strategic inflection point, a fateful crossroads. First option, full-scale escalation. They still had the final ace, the ballistic missile force. They could order the carrier-killer missile brigades to open fire, activate the DF-21D and DF-26. But that would be suicide, a gamble they cannot win. Firing a ballistic missile at a U.S. carrier would mean World War III, a war of annihilation, for which China's economy is not ready, and their military, just proven technologically inferior, cannot endure. Second option, swallow the humiliation and withdraw. That would mean the entire deterrent prestige China painstakingly built in the South China Sea collapses completely. It would send a message to the neighbors that China is only a paper tiger, and the U.S. is the power that sets the rules. They chose neither. They chose a third path, a more cunning and more desperate gambit. If they cannot beat the U.S. militarily, they will strangle it economically. China's in a move that shocked the world, declared a no-fly zone and a massive no-sail zone, covering nearly the entire South China Sea. The official pretext: large-scale live-fire exercises for national security. After the terrorist attack by the U.S., this was no longer an exercise. It was an economic blockade. They aimed to choke the world's most vital sea lane, through which over 30% of global trade passes. Thousands of oil tankers and container ships would have to stop or take longer, costlier routes. An already fragile global supply chain would snap instantly. They were taking the world hostage, forcing Washington, Tokyo, and Brussels back to the negotiating table or face a global recession. Worldwide, they believed the U.S. wouldn't dare challenge a lawful exercise, lest it look like the aggressor. Washington countered immediately. The U.S. president called it modern-day piracy. But this time, the Pentagon did not send a second carrier group, nor sail warships into that exercise trap. That could invite miscalculation. They needed a decisive blow, one that would break the blockade and break Beijing's will. They used a final instrument of strategic deterrence, a weapon China knew existed, but had never truly believed in its power. Until today, 2B-21 Raider strategic stealth bombers. The Raiders, the most advanced war machines on Earth, quietly took off from a base on Guam, or perhaps from the U.S. mainland itself, flying halfway around the globe. They did not fly fast. They cruised slowly, serenely, at extreme altitude. They flew straight into the restricted zone China had just declared, passing over the outer picket of Type 052D destroyers guarding the exercise. They slipped past S-400 air defenses and S-300 systems deployed on Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi reefs. On China's radar screens, nothing but emptiness. They saw nothing, heard nothing. A deadly silence. Billion-dollar metal bats hovered right above them, like ghosts of the heavens, and they had no idea. The B-21s dropped not a single bomb. Their mission was even more terrifying. They deliberately loitered right over China's illegal military outposts in the Spratlys, switched on their electro-optical sensors, and began taking pictures. Hours later, at an emergency Pentagon press briefing, the spokesman said little. He simply released a series of photos and a few short video clips. The whole world held its breath. They were infrared and optical images, razor-sharp down to every detail, shot from a straight-down, top-down angle. One photo clearly showed a Chinese HQ-9 missile launcher on Fiery Cross Reef, with soldiers moving beneath it. Another photo was a close-up for J-16s on Mischief Reef, so clear you could count each aircraft. A short video captured a Type 052D warship underway, clear enough to read the hull number 175. No commentary, only a threat, just those images. If the strike on the HD-981 rig was a physical punch, this was a psychological finisher. In Beijing, it was a total collapse. The shock was even greater than the F-35s. They realized something horrific. Their entire invulnerable defense system, the A2/AD bubble, anti-access, area denial, built in the South China Sea with billions of dollars, was utterly naked, utterly useless. Before America's new generation stealth weapon, Washington's message was crystal clear and ruthless. Last night, we destroyed your rig with F-35s because you crossed the red line. Today, we're showing you that our B-21s can destroy anything you have in the South China Sea, from missile launchers to runways to warships, anytime we wish. And you will never know what hit you. The real loss was no longer the HD-981 rig. The greatest loss was face and deterrent prestige. The entire strategy of using artificial islands as unsinkable aircraft carriers for China collapsed in just 1 hour. They are not carriers. They're billion-dollar fixed targets. For target practice, before America's unstoppable stealth power, the price had surpassed imagination. Beijing could not continue the game. They could not enforce the zones they had just declared, knowing the U.S. could come and go at will. Keeping them in place would only deepen the humiliation, exposing their impotence to the world. Hours after the Pentagon briefing, China's state news agency quietly reported the South China Sea live-fire exercise had successfully met its stated objectives and ended ahead of schedule. The warships quietly withdrew to Yulin Naval Base. The storm had temporarily passed. The board had been completely reset. The crisis, born of an arrogant act, had subsided for now. The HD-981 rig had become a cold grave at the bottom of the South China Sea. No longer a symbol of expansionist ambition, it was a 10,000-ton steel monument to an ambition that had been broken. Silence blanketed the waters, a taut silence, thick with the fading smell of gunpowder. The parties sat down to negotiate, not because they longed for peace, but because they had just seen the true cost of war. The United States had redrawn the red line. It had proved, ruthlessly, that the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines was not a Cold War scrap of paper. It was written in steel, underwritten by gunpowder. The surgical strike on the rig, and the B-21 psychological deterrent, had redefined the rules of the sky. China fell silent, a terrifying silence. They had lost a battle, bitter, humiliating defeat. But the long strategic contest goes on. Beijing will not forget. They will dissect this defeat, pour in billions of dollars to counter stealth technology, improve quantum radars, and develop faster hypersonic weapons. They stepped back, only to prepare for a leap, more dangerous in the future. The lessons drawn from this hypothetical scenario are profound. Peace has never been something readily available. It does not come from goodwill or diplomatic appeals. It comes from real deterrent capability, and more importantly, the willingness to act when the red line is crossed. This scenario also shows the deadly limits of gray zone strategy. When gray zone tactics are pushed too far, like brazenly towing an oil rig into the territory of a nation with a strong ally, it is no longer gray. It turns into the red zone of conventional conflict, where water cannons and Coast Guard cutters mean nothing, giving way to missiles and stealth aircraft. Whoever knows where the enemy is, while the enemy doesn't know where they are, that side will win. This battle was decided by the F-35s, the EA-18Gs, and the B-21s. Before the other side, they were in a war. The lesson is even clearer. On a great power chessboard, absolute neutrality is a fantasy. Internal strength, a smart asymmetric defense capability built on missiles, submarines, and electronic warfare, combined with supreme finesse in multilateral diplomacy, together with the utmost deftness in multilateral diplomacy, is the only key to protecting sovereignty. Because in the South China Sea, storm can rise overnight.